thank here our guests, Temple, also Triodos Bank, the publisher, and I'm Dirk Holmans, director of Oikos think tank. We are looking for a marvelous narrative on a new economy. Before that, we will start with a very short video of Triodos Bank, after which Herman Steinmeier, Head of Marketing of Communications, will give a brief introduction, because I think it's important that we have a very good ethical bank in Belgium, so it's very nice to work together. It's very interesting to read that Kate Warren describes herself as a renegade economist. Renegade means in Dutch afvallig. Ze beschrijft zichzelf als een afvallige economiste. Which means that she's quite critical about the traditional mainstream economics. And in her book, she's looking there for a new economic mindset, which allows us to confront the ecological and social challenges of the 21st century. And as I myself, I really hate people giving too long introductions. I will always stop here. And we'll first have a 2-minute video, and then I invite Herman to the floor.
It's the talk of the town. Growth. Are we growing enough? And do we actually need to grow? At the moment we're fixated on numbers, but what does a number say about us? Are we suddenly 0.1% happier, and the next minute 0.1% unhappier? Or is growth really only about buying more stuff and selling more? You can also look at growth another way, and then you'll see that we're actually doing pretty well. Yes, we're building fewer new offices and shopping centres, but we're also improving the schools, hospitals and nursing homes we already have. By making them more energy efficient, we save money, which can pay for more teachers and carers. Now that's growth. And yes, fewer cars are being sold, yet we are more mobile than ever. Cars are becoming much easier to share, just like music and houses and all kinds of other stuff. So what's bad for the economy is actually good for society. We grow by sharing. And sometimes by doing nothing. More and more gardeners are fighting garden pests with ladybirds, not pesticides. So sometimes doing something small is the best way to achieve something big. There are families who are starting their own energy companies, butchers who make meat from plants, entrepreneurs who are busy inventing things today that will make the world a little better tomorrow. More and more people and businesses are taking things into their own hands and are helping us grow like never before. A type of growth that's about more than just numbers. It's really quite simple. Everything you give attention to grows. What do you want to grow? Follow your heart, use your head. Triodos Bank.
Hello, I just found out that we have another thing in common that we need to, I don't like very much long introductions. Hello everyone. On behalf of Triodos Bank, also a warm welcome. Thank you, Kate, for being here among us, and thank you, Dirk, to make and Oikos to make the association between this evening, this event, and Triodos Bank. At Triodos Bank, what we do is we finance positive change. What do we mean with that is that projects of entrepreneurs and organizations that contribute to create a better, more sustainable world, that's what we do. You can find, by the way, you can find all the projects that we finance, you can find them on our website. But at the same time, and this is also very important to us, is that we aim to change finance. This is another thing that to finance change, to change finance. We use our license to bank, our expertise in sustainability, and our influence to change the financial system from within so that it puts people's interest first. And that's very important, to put people's interest first, while allowing us to live within our, and we have to say it, Kate, you'll tell all about this, within the planet's limits. Now, that's what we do, and that's what we believe in, and we will continue and continue and continue doing it. But like many other actors of this movement for societal change, we are also convinced of the need to change also the language. We're talking about the language in which we think and discuss economics, and by doing so, change the role of economics. What do I mean with that? Well, economy as a means to serve the health of the planet and the people that live in it. Now, not only now, but also for the future generations. Well, I think, convinced that this is exactly what Doughnut Economics 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist is all about, and why, Kate, your book and your conferences are so welcomed. At the end of the month now in Davos, I was well informed at the World Economic Forum, and now today here in Ligt. Kate, thank you for making us part of your journey, talking to people all over the world to address our common challenge, which is finding an economic model that tackles both ecological and social issues. Kate, the floor is yours.
It's really lovely to be here. Thank you for such a lovely introduction for both of you. It is true, I'm going to Davos at the end of this month. I'm going into the belly of the beast. But I'll tell you a secret, I feel much, much more at home here. I've only just arrived here for the first... I'm avoiding saying the name of the city because I can't say it very well. Here, I'm loving your city. And Dirk has been telling me about many of the amazing initiatives that go on here, and 5% of people are vegetarians. So I'm already thinking I'm going to go home and say to my partner, maybe we should, move. Especially with bloody Brexit. Let's get into Europe. So I'm really delighted to be here. But before I jump in and talk about donuts, I want to just find a little bit about who's here. So, if you've ever studied economics at high school or a little bit of university or any form of economics, just can you put your hand up? Okay, quite a few people. And if you've never studied economics and cannot believe you've come along to a talk with economics in the title, put your hand up. Yes, okay. We're going to make it worth your while. Great. Well, let me jump in. First, I'm going to give you the health warning. Don't eat too many donuts. In fact, you might want to not eat any at all. They're not very good for you. I'm going to introduce you to the only one that actually might turn out to be good for us. But let me tell you why I'm here. So I'm here because I was a teenager of the 1980s. I grew up, like some of you I'm 47, let's just put that on the floor. So some of you in the audience, like me, grew up seeing a famine in Ethiopia, which rocked the world and struck everybody. I saw a hole opening up in the ozone layer. The Exxon Valdez oil tanker spilled out all its oil into Alaska. Reagan and Thatcher came to power. And so by the end of the 1980s, I just knew one thing, which is I wanted to help change the world. I wanted to work for Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth or Oxfam, something like that. And so I thought the best way to equip myself to do this was to learn the mother tongue of public policy. So off I went to university. There's me with my first ever economics textbook, very excited, reading it. And I thought, if I learn economics, this mother tongue of public policy, then I will be equipped to take on these challenges. So I studied economics for 4 years at university. But I was frustrated and disappointed by the theories I was taught, because I felt the issues I cared most about, like environmental integrity and social justice, were somehow at the margins of the theory. You had to hunt them out if you really wanted to study them. And so after 4 years of study, I decided to walk away from academic economics and immerse myself in real-world economic challenges. So I spent 3 years working as an economist in the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Zanzibar, working with barefoot entrepreneurs who were raising their kids with nothing but the forest, their community, and their wits. Then I spent 4 years working at UNDP in New York, an economist helping write the Human Development Report that comes out every year, aiming to redefine what we think development is and how we should measure it. And then I fulfilled one of my teenage dreams, and I spent a decade working with Oxfam. We campaigned for labour rights in global supply chains. We campaigned to make it clear that climate change is a question of social justice. And then I became a mother of twins. And I began to understand gender politics in a way that you never quite do until you're changing 2 nappies at once. And through all this, I realised that I'd spent my working life so far trying to make visible, trying to give voice to issues that I felt were at the margins of mainstream economics and didn't get represented fully. So I decided to leave my job at Oxfam, and I thought the best thing I can do next is to write a book about new economic thinking. I pushed aside my old textbooks and I delved into feminist economics, ecological economics, complexity, institutional, behavioural economics. And so now I teach at the Environmental Change Institute in Oxford University and have spent this time writing this book, and I'm really enjoying sharing the message of it and having a dialogue with people. And in all of this, I'm inspired by a quote from a great American inventor of the last century, called Buckminster Fuller. He said, "You never change things by fighting existing reality. To change something, create a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." Of course we need to fight the existing reality, but we also need to build the new thing to prove that something else is possible. There's another way of doing things. Sometimes the best form of protest is to propose something new. And when he says, build a new model, when we come to economics, often we think a model is going to be a set of equations. But long before equations and maths, every model begins with an idea, an understanding of what matters and what doesn't matter, of how things are related to each other. It often begins with a picture, whether or not we draw it. Because pictures are incredibly powerful. They can be paradigm changing. Copernicus certainly knew that. In the 1500s, he was watching the motion of the planets, and he knew that Ptolemy over here, who had drawn Earth unmoving at the centre of the universe, Copernicus knew that Ptolemy had it all wrong. But he waited until he was on his deathbed before he dared to publish his alternative, because he knew that by putting the sun, not Earth, at the centre of the known universe, he was threatening the power of the Pope. He was challenging the authority of the church, and he was upending humanity's sense of our place in the universe. So it's extraordinary what havoc a few concentric circles can unleash. So I think it's time for a Copernican revolution of our own. Not where are we in the universe, something much closer to home. What is well-being? What does it depend upon? And silly though it sounds, I think it looks like a donut. So let me tell you about this donut, the only one that we should actually eat. And the hole in the middle is a place where people are falling short on life's essentials. People don't have the food or healthcare, housing, water, access to electricity, political voice, gender equality, all the essentials of life that every human being needs to have a life of dignity and opportunity and community. And these 12 dimensions, I crowdsourced them from the world's governments. They are the 12 social priorities set out in the Global Sustainable Development Goals. So they're the most up-to-date statement of what all the world's governments have agreed that every person on Earth has a claim to. We want to get everyone in the world out of that hole and into the donut itself. But, and it's a very big but, we can't overshoot the outer ring. Because there we put so much pressure on this extraordinary, unique, living planet that we begin to kick it out of balance. We cause climate breakdown, catastrophic biodiversity loss, acidify the oceans. And these 9 dimensions around the outside, these are the 9 planetary boundaries, first drawn up by around 30 Earth system scientists in 2009. They looked back at the last 100,000 years of life on Earth and saw that just the last 11,000 have been far warmer and far more stable than all that came before. And they said, why? What is it about this period that has kept Earth in such a benevolent state for humanity? It's our home sweet home. We created agriculture. All great human civilizations, from ancient China, ancient Egypt, the Mayans, Greeks and the Romans, all sprung up in this phase. So we'd be crazy to kick ourselves out. And they identified these 9 and said, these are the life-supporting systems on which we depend to keep us in this balance. And uninterrupted, they think it continue for another 50,000 years. So the simplest way of putting these together, I can say, is it's a compass that aims to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And of course, the 2 sides are deeply interdependent. You want food, then you need fertile soils and a stable climate and rainfall. You want fresh water, you need the rivers recharged. You want health, you need a protective ozone layer. So we're deeply interdependent with these outer boundaries, and we put pressure on them. So I would say this is one way of drawing a compass for the 21st century. But if it's a compass, you want to know where the needle's pointing. And that's not an easy picture to look at. Because on every one of those social foundations, millions or billions of people are falling short. On food, for example, that little red wedge goes 11% of the way towards the middle of the circle, because 11% of people worldwide don't have enough food to eat. On water, I've got 2 measures. That's 9% of people don't have access to clean water, and 1 person in 3 worldwide doesn't have access to what we would call a toilet. But on every one of those measures, you can see people are falling short. And yet, we've already overshot at least 4 of these planetary boundaries. The limit on climate change is 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But we went over 410 parts per million in April last year. We're massively over on biodiversity loss, on excessive fertilizer use with nitrogen and phosphorus. If these lines were complete, they would hit the floor of this stage. And on land conversion, we don't even know where we are on chemical pollution and on air pollution. So this is a picture of humanity and our planetary home at the beginning of this century. It's our selfie. And it belongs to us, this image. No generation before us saw it. Why would we expect that the economists of last century's theories would be gripped to take this on? They never saw this picture. They didn't create theories for this. It's ours, and it's our challenge. I believe it's our generational challenge. I think this is what our children's children will remember us, the people of the early 21st century. It's what they'll remember us for. Not for Donald Trump. Not even for Brexit. But for this. Whether or not we began to turn this story around. Whether or not we actually, for the first time in human history, put ourselves on track for meeting the needs of all people, coming back within the means of the planet. It's obvious that many things have to change to make that possible. And I believe that among those changes, we need new conversations in parliaments. We need new conversations in boardrooms and in the media. And I profoundly believe that if we want to change the conversation in politics, in business and in the media, then it really matters what conversations go on here, in economics departments. Because many people in the world, like all of you putting your hands up, many people study a bit of economics. It's the first degree is the most important one. Only a tiny percentage stay on and do a PhD. But most people do a bit of economics and then go and become a politician, become a business leader, become a community leader, become a lawyer, a journalist. So what happens in the first degree frames the way that we have a public narrative about what the economy is and is for. It's incredibly important because it shapes the way we all think about the economy. And I know I'm not alone in believing this. Because worldwide, students at universities have come together, like me 25 years ago. They're frustrated with what they're being taught, and they founded Rethinking Economics. Over 20 countries now. There's a great irony here. The very people who have committed to spend years of their life and probably a lot of money studying economics, on arriving at university, the first thing they discover is that they have to help rewrite the syllabus. Because they realise it's not fit for the challenges that they know they're going to have to deal with this century. And I believe at the heart of economics, the education that they're getting in most universities in the world is a fundamental set of ideas captured so simply in some diagrams that they slip into the back of your mind without you even quite realising they're there, but deeply framing the way we think about what the economy is, what it's for, how it works, and who we are. And I want to give you a whirlwind tour of what I think is this last century economic mindset that we need to let go of, so that we can say goodbye and then create one anew that's fit for our times and our challenges and the world that we know that lies ahead. And so in doing this, we could have no better tour guide than this gentleman. This is Paul Samuelson. He was teaching at MIT in the 1940s. And Samuelson totally understood the power of the first degree in economics and its power in setting the narrative of how we think about the economy. He said, "I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treaties, so long as I can write the economics textbooks. The first lick is the privileged one, impinging on the beginner's tabula rasa at its most impressionable state." Yeah, Paul Samuelson thinks your mind is a blank slate, and he wants to lick it. You laugh, but he has already licked it, whether or not you've studied economics, because the diagrams that Samuelson drew have shaped the way we all think about what the economy is. So at MIT, he was actually teaching engineering students. They were just learning a little bit of economics on the side, and he wrote a textbook for them, a simple introduction. But when he decided to draw a picture of the economy, he wanted to make it easy for the engineering students. So he drew it looking a little bit like a radiator system, with water flowing around and around the tanks between business. He calls it public, we would call that households now. Now it captures an important insight, that money has a circular flow, that wages turn into spending, which turns into wages, which turns into spending. But this diagram has only changed a little bit in the last 70 years, and it's still the biggest picture that an economist can show you of the economy as a whole. It's known as the circular flow diagram. So we have households and businesses. Households provide their labour and their capital. In return, they get wages and profit, and they use that money as consumer spending to buy goods and services. So the money goes round and round, and so do the resources. Yes, not all of it goes on consumer spending. Some of it gets siphoned off as savings and gets put into banks, who then turn it into investments. Except that's actually not how most banking works. Banks create money, bearing debt, but I'm not even going to go there tonight. Some of it gets put as taxes by governments, and then they turn that taxation into public spending. But actually, that's not even how governments work. That's not the only way they make money. But I'm not even going to go there tonight either. And some of it is used to buy imports, but more money comes in from exports. This diagram is very valuable for measuring the national income accounts, measuring GDP. It's useful if you want to talk about Keynes's insights that if the economy falls into a depression, the government can boost its spending and help get the thing flowing round again. But the blank spaces, this is the biggest picture of the economy we've got. I like the sound effects. This is the biggest picture of the economy we've got, and it's absolutely silent on the living world. It makes no mention of all the materials and living matter and energy that are drawn daily into the economy and spewed out as waste and pollution. The economists will say, well, but that's an externality. Yes, environmental externalities, of course economists recognise that. And I say, if you have to talk about breakdown of the climate, about catastrophic biodiversity loss, about the destruction of the living world as an externality, you can already hear that there's something wrong with the theory. This diagram is absolutely silent on all the unpaid caring work of parents, cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, raising the children, doing it all again tomorrow, to make that labour fresh and ready for work every day. And it's absolutely silent on the commons, the place where people get together, not with the market, not with the state, but as a community, and co-create things that they value, whether it's a garden on the corner of the neighbourhood block, or Wikipedia, or Linux online. Well, if the biggest picture of the economy we've got at the start of the 21st century is silent on the living world, silent on unpaid care, silent on the commons, it is missing three of the most fundamental sources of our well-being, and those silences are going to come back to bite us. What about who we are? And this story goes back, of course, to Adam Smith, but Smith had a nuanced view of who we are. He knew that self-interest can be powerful for making markets work, but our interest in others is essential for making society work. And he celebrated our sense of generosity, our public spirit, our sense of justice, compassion. The trouble was, this was too nuanced a picture of humanity to fit into a model. So when future economists came along, like John Stuart Mill, Mill was a brilliant philosopher and economist, but he did something that wasn't very helpful. He said, political economy does not treat the whole of man's nature, nor the whole of his conduct in society. It sees him merely as a being who desires to possess wealth. He plucked out just that trait of DNA, of self-interest to create humanity at the heart of economics. And economists after him added characteristics to this creature that we now know as rational economic man. Now, he never actually gets drawn in the textbooks, but since pictures are powerful, I decided to draw him. And he'd have to look a bit like this. He would be a man, standing alone, money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. He hates work, he loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. And the problem with this character is not how absurdly narrow he is, it's what looking at him does to us. Because on being told that he is like us, we actually become more like him. Research has found, and I find this fascinating, research has found that the more that economic students learn from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 about rational economic man, the more they come to say they value self-interest and competition, and the less importance they give to altruism and collaboration. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. There's a reflexivity in the model here. We're going to be more than 10 billion people on this planet this century. And if we continue to imagine and conduct and justify ourselves as rational economic man, I think we stand very little chance of thriving here together, because we start to mirror him. What about how the economy works? This is a fascinating story that goes back to the 1870s, when a small band of economists wanted to turn economics from an art into a science and make it as reputable as physics. So they looked to the physics great of the day, Sir Isaac Newton. This is Newton's diagram of gravity pulling a ball to rest. And so when William Stanley Jevons, the famous English economist, began drawing his diagrams, he drew them in the style of Newton. It looks like physics. It smells like physics. It must be physics. This is science. And this diagram that Newton's deriving, it's actually the first diagram, part of the first diagram, that every student still learns today. Let me try. What's the first diagram you remember from learning in economics? I can hear you whispering it. It's demand and supply. Exactly. That's where it comes from. Jevons would say, just as gravity pulls a pendulum to rest, so prices pull markets into equilibrium. He was trying to show this analogy. He started to talk of the market mechanism, the mechanism of competition, the laws of supply and demand. This is not how markets move. But the really pernicious effects, I think, of this attempt to be like physics, this particular kind of physics, is that just as Newton had discovered the physical laws of motion, it sent economists off searching for economic laws of motion. And when data became widely available, there was a scramble to be the one to get your name on that law. Two such laws of motion have turned out to influence all of our lives hugely for decades. The first one here is the Kuznets curve. It was drawn by Simon Kuznets in the 1950s. He was a brilliant economist. He got a little bit of data from the UK, Germany and the US on inequality over time, and he said, I think I see a pattern. That as countries get richer, first inequality increases, but then it decreases. And the next thing Doughnut says is, I wouldn't expect to see this. I would expect the rich to get richer, not the poor to catch up. He couldn't understand the data. He even said, I have 5% empirical information, 95% speculation, and maybe a little bit of wishful thinking. It would be terrible if this became an unwarranted dogmatic generalization. But it did, because by the time it was drawn as a curve, it took on a life of its own, and it begins to whisper out a mantra, which is, if you care about inequality, don't try to redistribute. Growth will even things up. Thomas Piketty came along in 2014 and went back and looked at the same data with a lot more to look at. And he said, you know what, Doughnut was right. This is the pattern he saw. But he was measuring it at a very particular moment in history, from pre-war to post-war. War destroys the capital of the wealthy. And after the Second World War, you had massive government investment in health, education, and housing. So it was war and government spending that bent the curve down, not the inherent workings of the market. But still today, this lives on in trickle-down economics that policymakers are using, in austerity economics. We have to go through the pain together if we're going to come out on the other side. You still hear it, so this shows just how powerful images are. Even now, within economics departments, everybody knows that this doesn't hold anymore, but the mantra lives on in the world of policy. This is how powerful pictures are. Then the second one came in the 1990s. Two economists had a little bit of data on local air and water pollution, and they said, we think we see a pattern. As countries get richer, first pollution increases, but then it decreases. As if like a well-trained child, growth will clean up after itself. Except it doesn't, because when you have global data, and you take account of global carbon emissions and global material footprints, this curve does not automatically bend down. These are not real economic laws of motion. Growth doesn't even things up and clean things up. But their legacy lives on. Still today, some countries are run by policymakers who think, let's grow now and clean up later, as if this curve existed. So the physics here turned out to be false, but it was a jolly good excuse meanwhile for pursuing growth. And this story again goes back to Simon Doughnut, poor man, because he would be mortified if he knew how his theories have been used today. In the 1930s, he was asked by US Congress to come up with a single number to measure the value of the US economy, and he did. He called it national income. Today we call it GDP. But he said, you know, this can scarcely be used to infer the welfare of a nation. Why? Well, he said, well, it says nothing about the unpaid caring work of parents. It says nothing about the value of goods and services created by the community. And it's just a flow measure. It doesn't tell you what's happening to the stock of capital, to the landscape, to the nature from which this is generated. See, he saw all the caveats from the beginning. But the temptation of a single number was too great for policymakers. They tucked those aside and pursued growth, to the point that in the 1960s, W.W. Rostow wrote a book that I love so much, I have a first edition. It's called The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. You can smell the politics. And he said there are 5 stages to any country's growth progress. First, you get traditional society in which nothing much is really happening. Then you get the preconditions for takeoff. You get the beginnings of a finance industry. You get education for work. You get industrialization. Then you get takeoff itself, where growth becomes the normal condition, and the march of compound interest can bear its blessings. Then you get the 4th stage of maturity, when you can have any industry you want, no matter what your resource base. And the 5th and final stage is the era of high mass consumption, where people can buy the consumer goods they want, like bicycles and sewing machines. This was 1960. So you can hear the aeroplane ride inherent in his story. But of course, this aeroplane is unlike any other. It can never be allowed to land. We've been left flying into the sunset of mass consumerism because growth has become the normal condition. It's institutionalized in the political, financial, and cultural and social systems. So, I've told you the story behind these diagrams, and you can hear that in each one There was a brilliant idea, which at the time made sense, but there are caveats or blind spots around them. And I believe it's precisely in those blind spots, the blank spaces, the caveats, that very powerful stories can get written. And that's just what happened in the 1940s. A small band of economists met in a little Swiss village called Montpellier, and they said, we're going to write a new economic story, and we're going to call it neoliberalism. This is Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and they were joined by others. You see, they were motivated. You have to understand why people were motivated, because all these people are smart people. They were motivated by a fear of the rise of the totalitarian state in the USSR. But that pushback against the totalitarian state, which they thought, if you give the state an inch, it'll take a mile. In fact, it'll take the whole damn lot. So you have to minimize the role of the state in society. That pushback against the state very quickly morphed into a market fundamentalism, the idea that markets will always be the first best way of providing for things. They couldn't get their ideas put into practice for a long time. So they seeded them in think tanks, in chambers of commerce, and in political parties. And it was not until the 1980s when Reagan and Thatcher came to power. Reagan had 20 members of the Montpellier Society in his presidential election team. Margaret Thatcher's first Chancellor of the Exchequer, like a finance minister, was a member of the Montpellier Society. And so when Reagan and Thatcher came to power, they put this story on the stage. And I believe that in many countries, it doesn't feel like here when I hear about the story here, maybe it is, you tell me. In many countries, we've been living by this story ever since. And it's a story of the economy, the neoliberal story, which stars the market because it's efficient, so you should give it free rein. It's a story that stars finance, which is infallible, so trust in its ways. It stars trade, which is win-win, so open your borders. And since every great story has a villain, it stars the state, which is incompetent, so don't let it meddle. Now these are the stars of the neoliberal script, and it was written by Milton Friedman. He was a brilliant master storyteller of this. These are the stars, but there are other characters, not really needed on stage, left off in the wings, but let's meet them anyway. Well, there's the household, but that's domestic, so you can leave it to the women. The commons are tragic. The tragedy of the commons, we should sell them off. Society, as Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society. So we can ignore that. Earth, they said, is inexhaustible. That's their word. So take all you want. And as for power, no, this is positive, objective science economics. So we don't need to talk about power. There's no values embedded in here. You don't need to mention it. I believe behind this script, of course, is a very different story. As it is in any theatre, there's a different story going on behind the stage. It's actually also a story of massive corporate funding of politics, particularly in the US, but in many countries, that too close connection between big business and politics. It's a story of banks that were clearly fallible, but were far too big to fail and so had to be bailed out. It's a story of companies that lie to the public about what they know about the damage of their effects on climate change. And it's an extraordinary story in which today the richest 1% of people in the world own half of the wealth. I cannot actually get my head around that. I believe this story has been driving us to the brink of collapse. To the point where we now have a world in which many millions of people cannot meet their most basic needs, but we've overshot planetary boundaries. And we were sold it with these fake laws of motion. You care about inequality? Don't try to redistribute. Growth will even things up. You care about the planet? Don't try to regulate, because growth will clean things up. Except it doesn't, and it won't. So I believe it's time for a new story, and a new look again, to find models and ideas, the fundamentals of what we think the economy is and is for, that is fit for our times, given what we know. And I go back to the words of John Maynard Keynes, a very wise man, who said, economics is the science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing models which are relevant to the contemporary world. I think too much time in economics education is taken up with the science of thinking in terms of models, and many students I speak to say it's all maths and all dealing with equations. I think we're at a critical moment in time where we need to turn back to the art of choosing models. And instead of maths and equations, if you want to choose the right models, you need a pencil. Let's go back and draw again. Reimagine the fundamentals of what the economy is and is for. and how it works. So I want to give you a whirlwind tour of the new pictures that I would draw to put at the heart of 21st century economics. So, let's start with a question that I was never even invited to ask in my 4 years of economic studies. Let's start with purpose. What is the economy for? I believe one way we can say what the economy is for this century is to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. That is its purpose and goal, and by which it should be judged. Then if you were showing students the very first picture, remember Samuelson said the first lick is the privileged one. So what's the first picture you're going to show to economic students? I wouldn't start where we nearly all started, with supply and demand. That's like saying the economy is the market and the market's in equilibrium. That's two untruths in one sentence, and it's not a good place to start a degree. I would start with this diagram, and I call it the embedded economy diagram. So we've got the economy embedded in society, embedded in the living world, with solar energy river flowing right through it, drawing in materials and matter, spewing out waste and pollution. So right from day one we can ask the first question of ecological economics, which is how big can the through flow of materials and matter be in the economy before we begin to disrupt the very life support systems on which our well-being utterly depends. But also within the economy, you can see I've divided it into 4 key provisioning sectors. It's not just the market and the state. Thanks to that neoliberal script, that became a 20th century ideological boxing match. Are you for the laissez-faire market capitalism, or are you for state-loving socialism? In between, in that space of boxing match, we lost sight of 2 key forms of provisioning. One, the household, where each one of us begins every day raising our children, caring for our parents, our partners, ourselves. That place of unpaid caring work on which everything else depends. But also the commons, where we get together as people, as citizens, and organise to provide things that we value. And thanks to the work of Elinor Ostrom, which has made clear that the commons don't have to be tragic, they can actually be a triumph. But also thanks to the digital commons, which mean that communicating and organising online means the commons are resurgent this century, and it's one of the most dynamic spaces of economic organising. And then you've got finance in the middle, because finance should be a flow in service to society. What would it look like to have a financial sector that actually served these 4 forms of provisioning in service to life? Very different financial sector than the one we have today. A few exceptions, present company. What about who we are? Of course, we're far more interesting than rational economic man. And if there's one place where I'd say mainstream economics has embraced this, it is, of course, in behavioural economics, because there's been such a rich area of study coming from political science, cognitive science, neuroscience, Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Richard Thaler, so many interesting theories coming in. We are socially reciprocating. We collaborate with each other, and we punish each other when we don't collaborate back. We don't actually have fixed preferences as rational economic man assumed, and let me tell you why. We have fluid values. If I gave this room a survey to ask you questions about your values and preferences, but this half of the room, the front page said it's a consumer reaction study, and in this half of the room it said it's a citizen reaction study, research shows that you'd fill it in differently, because I've activated the consumer and I've activated the citizen, because who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. Even the names by which we're called changes how we respond. And we're not dominant over nature, we're deeply embedded in the web of life. The sooner this new portrait gets rewritten, and it is being rewritten now, the better, because we urgently need this rich reconception of ourselves at the heart of economics. What about the story of how it works? I would lay aside the equilibrium thinking, as many other sciences have already done. And if you never quite got that joke about why did the chicken cross the road, it's actually because he wanted to teach you systems thinking. So here's the core ideas of systems thinking and complexity. These are 2 feedback loops, and this is a reinforcing feedback loop. And the fundamentals of that means the more you have, the more you get. So the more chickens you have, the more eggs you get, and the more eggs you have, the more chickens you get. And anything in life that spirals up, or spirals down, is dominated by reinforcing feedback. But then there's also the balancing feedback loop. the more you have, the less you get back. So the more chickens you have, the more try to cross the road. But the more try to cross the road, very sadly, fewer come back. And our bodies are dominated by balancing feedback. So when I get hot, my body sweats to cool me down. When I get cold, I shiver to warm up. That's how we stay at a constant temperature, and that's what health is, maintaining balance. It's the interaction of these balancing and reinforcing feedbacks. Adding some delay, you get emergent properties, and you can explain the most fascinating patterns of the world around us, from the dynamics of your family relationships. There's always somebody who likes to wind things up, and then somebody who likes to calm things down. People are looking at each other knowingly now. But also the boom and bust of financial markets, the rise of the 1%, the collapse of ecosystems can be best explained using these feedback loops and complexity thinking. In fact, during the financial crisis, when the Queen of England said to the economists, "Why did nobody see it coming?" And they all went into a great jelly and didn't know what to say. But the economists said, literally, our models we don't know what happened, our models don't work anymore. People turned to the work of Hyman Minsky, who in 1975 wrote a paper called The Financial Instability Hypothesis. If you read Minsky, it's all feedback loops. He talks about how things reinforce each other and you reach a tipping point and it falls over. So even at the heart of understanding the financial crisis, this comes in handy. Which means economists need to make a fundamental metaphorical career change away from the mechanics of that Newtonian thinking. There are no levers of the economy. It's not a machine. The mechanisms, we should let go of that language and be more like Josephine Baker here, watering her garden, thinking of the garden not as the economy not as a mechanism, but an organism. It grows, it evolves, it has its own life going on. You can't control it, but you can steward it. You can shape it, just as a gardener can shape a garden with digging, weeding, pruning, grafting. So how should we shape our 21st century economic garden? Remember, we're letting go of those ideas that there were laws of motion, that it's going to get more unequal and then it will even up. It's going to get polluted, but then it will clean up, because that's not true. We need new ideas of design. And I would put two principles of economic design at the heart of 21st century economics. To create economies that are distributive by design and regenerative by design. I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. An economy that's distributive by design is one in which we pre-distribute the sources of wealth creation. In the 20th century, the focus of redistribution was on incomes, taxing the wealthy and redistributing to the poor every year, again and again. But in the 21st century, let's go deeper. Can we pre-distribute the sources of wealth creation so that everybody has a stake in where that wealth is actually generated? We've always invested in health and education because that's the fundamental wealth of each person lies in their own personal capacity and potential. But what's really exciting this century is that for the first time in human history, the key technologies of energy and ideas are distributed by design. 20th century energy was a coal field, an oil rig, a gas pipeline. 21st century energy, renewable energy, if you look at it from space, it already looks like this. It's a distributed network on every rooftop. 20th century ideas through the telegraph or through the telephone operator. 21st century, there's a computer in every pocket. It already looks like this from space, the internet. So for the first time in history, the ideas of the technologies of energy and ideas are asking to be distributed by design. It's unprecedented. Can we take advantage of that and create an economy that distributes more wealth by design? Housing. I come from London, a city in which a few large landlords own far too many of the houses, charging extortionate rents. But housing can be collectively owned or communally owned and designed in far more creative ways. Enterprise ownership. The 20th century was dominated by the stock company, with shareholders now taking ever-increasing dividends, with wage earners earning ever less of that share. We can reinvent that with more employee-owned companies, cooperatives, with workers themselves owning the value they create. And money creation. Is money created by the state, or commercial banks, or by the community itself as a complementary currency? These different designs of money have very different distributional outcomes. Let me give you a few examples. Oh no, I'll tell you about this first. Regenerative design. Through the middle of this diagram runs the degenerative, linear 20th century economy. We take Earth's materials, make it into stuff we want, use it for a while, and throw it away. And that cuts against the cycles of the living world. So we need to bend those arrows around. Let nature regenerate herself as she's done for nearly 4 billion years, but also technical materials like this little clicker. We should never be thrown away. The material should be used again and again and again. And it needs to be run on sunlight so that we're not taking energy from below the ground, but we're taking it up from the sky. It needs to be recognized that waste from one process is food for another. I like the phrase that waste, there's no such thing as waste. It's just a resource in the wrong place. It needs to be modular by design, so if this clicker breaks, we can take it apart and just mend the little piece that needs fixing, not throw the whole thing away. And it needs to be open source so that whoever's hands this ends up in can read what this material is and feed it back into an ecosystem of material reuse. So let me show you some examples of both of these together. So housing. Oh no, that's not housing. Here we are, toilets. One of those places where there are no toilets is in the slums of Kenya. But now there are, because an organisation called Sanergy came in and started to install micro-enterprise of toilets. So for the first time, people can use a toilet that has clean water, soap, and it's a clean toilet, and toilet paper. Human dignity and health. And it's owned by people throughout the community. The waste is collected every day, and it's turned into organic manure. So it's returned to the soil. This is essentially an enterprise that aims to close the loop of nitrogen. It also happens to be regenerative, but creates jobs throughout the community. So it's distributed by design too. If you were to buy a car from this company, Open Motors, it would arrive a bit like an IKEA shelf in a flat pack. And if you know what you're doing, you can assemble it in 1 hour, they say. But if you don't know what you're doing, you can take it to somebody who does, because the design is open source. Anybody can go on the internet and see how it's made, and what all the parts are made of, and how to assemble it. So anyone worldwide can set up. I assemble Open Motors cars, bring it to me, I'll assemble it for you, and then they can customize it to make it an airport buggy or a city street car. It's 100% electric. It's modular by design. You can repair just the piece that's missing. But this is the beginning of distributed 21st century manufacturing. I come from the city of Oxford, I live in the city of Oxford, where mini cars are produced, and they make the whole mini and then ship it all over the world, full of air. It's crazy. They should be shipping the parts and assembling them worldwide with a global research and development team adding customization and new designs. That's the beginning of the future. Over here, community-owned energy projects, whether it's in a big field or just installed onto the roof of every house. And ideas, this is a fab lab in Ann Arbor in the US, where community citizens can come, use 3D printers, Creative Commons licensing, tap into the World Wide Web of open source design. Not just happening in America, happening everywhere, including in this place, in Lomé, in Togo. So there's an unprecedented access to ideas for people who only recently got running water and a telephone. It's an incredible leap forward of possibility. So I believe that if we're going to meet the needs of all within the needs of the planet, we have to put these design principles at the heart of our economies. Create economies in which value created is shared far more equitably with everyone who helps to create it. Create economies that work with and within the cycles of the living world. But what does that mean for growth? Because Rosso left us flying off into that sunset of mass consumerism. And as he described, we have locked ourselves in, so that now we have economies that need to grow, whether or not it makes us thrive. The trouble is we're locked in because our economies have come financially, politically, and socially to expect, demand, and depend upon unending growth. Financially, because at the heart of the mainstream finance system is that demand for the maximum rate of return of finance. And because companies have to deliver dividends to their stockholders, so they're driven to keep growing too. And banks create money as debt, bearing interest. So financially locked into growth. Politically, because no leader wants to lose their place in this G20 family photo. But if your economy stops growing, well, you'll be booted out by the next emerging powerhouse. And socially locked in because we've been convinced by a century of consumerist propaganda that we improve ourselves by buying something more. I don't think any of these lock-ins are insurmountable, but they deserve far more attention than they're currently getting. Because Nothing in nature grows forever. In fact, if you're an ecologist or an epidemiologist or a biologist, you'll know that nature's growth curve has a very different shape. Everything in nature, whether it's your children's feet or an Amazon forest, things grow, wonderful healthy phase in life, growth, but then they grow up and mature and can thrive for a long, long time. My children are 9 years old now and their feet are growing so fast it's breaking my bank account. But at one point, maybe when they're 18, they'll stop growing and they'll have the same shoe size for the rest of their life. Why would we imagine that we could create economies that are the one thing that buck this trend? Because we think of growth as wonderful and healthy. We say, my children are growing, my garden is growing, and I say, yes. But if your friend goes to the doctor and the doctor tells her that she has a growth, that feels very different. Because we instinctively understand that in a complex, organic, living body, when there's something within it that's trying to grow without end, if that's not stopped, it's a threat to the body itself. It can destroy the host on which it depends. So we already understand that there's a problem when something grows forever within the living system. So I believe actually we need a new understanding of growth. We need economies that let us thrive whether or not they grow. And I want to replace Rostow's aeroplane metaphor because pictures and words and images matter. So instead of an aeroplane, and this is going to sound silly, let's imagine we're in an economy that has matured, it's got large amounts of economy like this country or my country, a lot of capital and buildings, we've invested for years, but we now need a transformation because it's currently divisive and degenerative. We want it to be distributive, inclusive and regenerative, so we need our economies to transform. And I know this is going to sound silly, but instead of an aeroplane ride, I think we actually all need to learn to be kite surfers. Now, has anybody here ever done kite surfing? There's always one. There he is. So I haven't. You're going to see that I haven't, but don't tell anybody. So kite surfer, basically on the surfboard. Imagine the surfboard is rolling over the waves of the regenerative economy. We're heading for regenerative design that works with and within the cycles of the living world. But also overhead, you've got a kite that's pulling on the winds of distributive design. Now, how on earth do you roll over the waves and work with the wind and go where you want to go? Because in the middle of all this, you have a bar that goes up and down like this, doesn't it? Yeah, he's nodding. It goes up and down like this, and you pull it to steer towards where you want to go, you see? Now that little responsive bar that's going up and down, watch a video later, you'll see it goes like this. I think that is the future that we need to allow GDP to have. Because in the 20th century, GDP had to be always rising. In the 21st century, I believe we need to move to a point where GDP becomes a response to that greater aim of becoming regenerative and distributive by design. I'll give you one example. The government of China is currently investing $360 billion in installing renewable energy capacity by 2020. That means a big upsweep for GDP as it goes in, but then once the capacity's in, it's near zero marginal cost to generate each watt of electricity. So GDP swings up and then not, in response to becoming a regenerative distributive energy system. I believe, I know it sounds a really big mind shift, but I believe this is the mind shift we need to make if we're going to have economies that allow us to grow, allow us to become regenerative and distributive without being addicted to having to always grow. And that's the incredible opportunity that there is as a 21st century economist to help design these economies. I can't imagine any job more exciting now than to be a 21st century economist contributing to this. So let me end with a new story of the economy to replace that old neoliberal one. It's a 21st century story of the economy that stars Earth because she's life-giving, she comes first. And so we must respect her boundaries. It's a stars society because we're foundational, so we must nurture our connections. It stars the household, which is core, where we all begin every day. So how do we value its contribution? It stars the market, which is powerful, really powerful. So how do we embed it wisely to make it work for us? It stars the commons because they're creative. How do we unleash their potential? And it stars the state because, of course, the state is essential. So how do we make it accountable and make it a partner to all of this possibility? As for finance, it's in service. How can we create finance that actually serves society? Business is incredibly innovative, but how do we give it purpose beyond maximizing profits or shareholder returns? Trade is double-edged. How do we make that fair? And power, it's pervasive. Economics is full of values. Economies and politics are full of values, so we need to talk about it and we need to check its abuse. I believe this is the beginnings of a 21st century story of the kind of economy we want to create if we're going to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And yes, of course, it comes with new pictures to embed that and those new patterns and ideas in our lives. And if you agree with me about the power of pictures, then you might like these. I've had the privilege of working with some of the world's best stop-motion animators to make a 1-minute video of each of the 7 ways to think that are set out in my book. And as you can see, they're silly, they're playful, they're irreverent, they're funny, because I think it's time to take economics out of the equations, which only a very few people can read, and put it back in pictures and images that we all understand, because we all have a claim on shaping and remaking the economy for the 21st century. Thank you very much, and I really look forward to this conversation.
Okay, Kate, thanks for this marvelous narrative. I hope everybody who studied economics starts all over again. I know perfectly. So, we will have a Q&A period now, and as always, it's very nice for your neighbors to be concise. So, who has the first question? Yeah, please.
Next to, thanks, actually you're a good teacher. That's first and foremost. So you have a lot of practice and it's very understandable and it reads like a trained book. So that's good, because non-economists should have access to knowledge. So thank you for that. But, a question, a technical part, an economic question. In the redistribution, you talk a lot about the redistribution going from the end of the process, which is wages and income, this redistribution through income, and you go to at the starting point. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that on top of the redistribution of means of production, mm-hmm. but not in this communist way, but of course mm-hmm. through cooperatives and commons mm-hmm. and all that, we need to add the redistribution of loss. Because we have not been taught to lose, to diminish, to go sober, to go within the means of aid, or to think about means and purpose. So where would you set, or where would you, in your scheme, in your flow, where would you, or is there a step to take, or a position in your flow that can help us show that losing is not bad, that actually losses are to be redistributed throughout, from the rich to upwards towards the rich. Like before we believed trickle down, now we have to upwards redistribute losses as well as gains.
What a great question. I love that concept of redistributing loss. I have to add it to my slide. Okay, let me just use this one. So when I work with students or groups in a workshop and I'll show them this picture and I'll say, right, I want you to spend the next 3 minutes talking to the person next to you about what do you think are the big determinants of whether or not humanity can do this, whether or not we can meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And I say, I want you to come up with ideas so big that it's only 1 word long, or maximum 2 words long. And we get all sorts of fantastic ideas. And one of them, of course, is inequality, right? We need to change inequality. We need to transform that, because this is an extraordinary unequal world. 1% own half the world's wealth. Take that climate change wedge that's sticking up there. Some economists a couple of years ago calculated that 45% of the carbon dioxide emissions that are released, so almost half of that wedge, is produced in the name of 10% of people in the world. I call it the global carbonistas, people living on every continent who fly here, fly there, eat meat every day, heating full blast with the windows open, high carbon lifestyles. So absolutely, that is the place to start in cutting global carbon emissions. That loss needs to trickle up. That's such a great concept. And then you say, does it have to be actually a loss of something? So it's about transforming what it is we think we actually want. Because at the moment, what's being produced out in consumption is carbon emissions. But actually what we really want is mobility, or heating, or great food. And if you can transform the idea of what that is, and it's part of a cultural transformation of what we think is normal, what we think is desirable. Another of the big words for this diagram, that what's going to determine it, is aspiration. What do you aspire to? What do you think is the good life? So absolutely transforming people's sense of, I want mobility, but actually, maybe I don't need to own my own car. Maybe I can have a car sharing club. Maybe I can bike everywhere. This is a bit more fun. So making available options that people can have the things they want, like mobility, connection, and belonging, but without the old polluting way. So I might have to talk in the future about redistributing loss as well. Thank you, that's a great point.
Okay, thanks.
Short question. This is a friendly question.
Is there another one coming?
When I listen to you, I hear Hazel Henderson and Herman Daly. What have you added?
Oh. Well, I'm very honoured that you hear Hazel Henderson and Herman Daly. What have I added? This diagram combines commons theory, ecological economics, and feminist economics. I invite you to show me another diagram that has all of those together in it, in one picture. My concern about previous economics, and Hazel Henderson, well, she was very broad, but Herman Daly, ecological economics. He didn't talk about unpaid caring work by women. We need to bring these together. The problem is we have at the moment feminist, ecological, institutional complexity, behavioural economics. They're often in different journals, different professors, going to different conferences. Never will we make a change if they're all fragmented like this. They need to be brought together to dance on one page. So my aim is to bring them together and to make them dance on one page. And then secondly, I'll say, my favourite quote from André Gide, everything that needs to be said has already been said. But since no one was listening, it has to be said again.
Thanks. Yes, please.
I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer. And in your regenerative economy, I was always taught that the law of entropy.
Mm-hmm.
How does entropy fit in this? Because you have materials which will degrade, and they will not necessarily be possible to be reused.
Yes.
Energy also degrades into heat.
Yes. Okay, so energy degrades into heat, which is why I have that river of solar energy flowing through my diagram. That shows entropy, exactly, the second law of thermodynamics. So some people call this the circular economy. And you would quite rightly point out it can't be a circle because things can't be used again and again and again forever. I call it a cyclical economy, and the way it's very useful to think of is, you see here, regenerate, capture value at each stage of decomposition. So natural materials, this is made of wood, I think, yeah, this is made of wood. Oh, okay, this is made of plywood. So it probably started life as something made of wood, a beautiful piece of wood. And as it degraded or rotted, maybe it was pulped and turned into plywood, second life. And then when that's no longer used, it'll be turned third cascade into sawdust. And fourth, then it gets degraded and put back into soil, and it can be turned all sorts of different uses. So it's cycles of degradation of the living world. Materials over here also go through cycles, right? When we use plastics and then we use it the second time, there's impurities and it has a lower use. We need to get smarter about getting more effectiveness so that they don't cycle down so fast, but they cycle more slowly. But recycling is actually one of the last things you want to do, right? The first thing you want to do is repair it. You want to reuse it. You want to refurbish it and turn it into something else. And the last, because of the energy loss that you talk about, is to recycle. So it's a transformation not just of the production systems, but actually of the culture of use and refurbishment. That's why it needs to be open source, so that it can be repaired and refurbished, so anybody can see. It's the difference between an Apple iPhone, which is intentionally glued shut, so nobody can get in except for Apple, and a Fairphone, which is intentionally wide open and you can see on the internet how to repair it yourself. So it's those transformations. But as you can also see, this isn't closed, this is still got. You just minimize lost matter and heat. Now, Earth has a carrying capacity to absorb some carbon dioxide, to regenerate something. So this is back to Herman Daly. We need to ensure that what we take from the new and what we allow to be lost is within Herman Daly's language, the carrying capacity of the Earth. But the vast majority of materials must be cycled. The EU is just introducing the Circular Economy package. The standards aren't high enough, but it's saying by 2035, 60% of materials must be recycled. It shouldn't say recycled, it should say refurbished again. But 60% of materials must be going around here, a maximum 10% going to landfill. So it's the beginnings of, in Europe, legislation that's actually starting to make these patterns happen.
And do we know how much the Earth can regenerate or...
That's what the planetary boundaries are for, right? That's why the scientists drew up, where's he gone? This, right? We're only just beginning to know, because we're so far behind in understanding our planetary home. Those limits are precisely the limits of carrying capacity as our best understanding. So we're just beginning to piece this thing together. So I don't want to make it sound naive, like we know we can do it, but we know that this is the patterns within which we must live. Would you agree?
I still have to study your...
Okay.
But it's a good answer.
Then the next question, we move over there up, please.
Hi, I have a question about the last bit that you were talking about, where you reintroduce a GDP as a measure that would be perturbated along the stable state. But if the measure of GDP in itself is kind of flawed and also capturing other characteristics of living or being part of a society, why still choose that measure? Because how, for example, does natural capital or ecosystem services and valuing those capital as, because there is ideas in environmental ecology which also relate to valuing capital and measuring some kind of growth or stock in them. So how would you take that into account in that aspect as well? And would you think GDP would remain the measure that we need to look at, or maybe also look at a different measure?
Okay, so let's just go to that slide. So in a simple term, and you clearly know a lot about this, but just to bring everyone in simple terms, there's sort of two ways you can go with GDP. Nearly everybody now agrees this is not a good measure for progress. Politicians will say it, economists will say it, although I've just come from the Netherlands, and the King of the Netherlands last week said, our economy is thriving because it's growing at 3% GDP. So this just shows how deeply embedded that narrative is, because we don't yet have an alternative metric for measuring what progress looks like. So there's two camps of what we should do. One group, Herman Daly and others, say, transform GDP so that it counts good things, and he made something called the genuine progress indicator, so that when it goes up, that's good, and when it goes down, that's bad. So you can bring in natural capital, ecosystem services, try and count in all the things that you value. I haven't gone that route in this book. For me, if anything, the fundamental measure is the donut itself, with us going overshooting and falling short, because to me that's the fundamental test of whether or not we're doing well. But then there's another group that could say, well, just let GDP be. GDP is just the value of goods and services sold in the economy. It's just the value of what's going on in the market. And I've gone there with this one. It's not a measure of success or not anymore. It's just a variable. It's still important for governments to know. You want to know it. It's like having on a dashboard on a car. It's one of the things you want to know, but it doesn't tell you whether you're going in the right direction or not anymore.